Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV, and I promised you a few of my Woody's thoughts, little shows about my visit to Central Europe. And one of the things you may have noticed if you follow me on Twitter or on Facebook is that I visited a large number of Soviet Red Army memorials, and it caused some kind of confusion in my head because I'm from Normandy, where the monuments are to the liberators, and the liberators were absolutely the liberators. The British, Canadian, American forces brought liberation to Normandy, and I have been to Market Garden and Belgium and Netherlands, and you know, you understand what the word liberator means. Of course, when you're in Central Europe, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the liberation by the Red Army was initially a liberation and then turned into something very different, usually because the Soviets then occupied, controlled. We can use all sorts of different language to describe what happened over the next decades, but it certainly wasn't the liberation most of the people within that within those areas would have hoped for. And so I'm just going to sort of talk about that and show you some photos from my visit, and I welcome your comments and questions. So we started off our trip in Budapest, and we were visiting cemeteries for two reasons. One is we were seeing the graves, but also in this particular case, this cemetery was the scene of fighting. These Soviet graves were put where Soviet soldiers were fighting in 1945. This area had been a pre-war civilian cemetery, and the fighting went right through it. And there are graves around the edges of the cemetery that contain spang, which, as you know, is a word we use in World War II TV to describe bullet and shrapnel damage. So the fighting went through this. So it was a front line for some time during the initial stages of the siege of Budapest. And now, since the end of the war, it is now the permanent place where these Soviet soldiers rest. And it's interesting because it brings up this conflict, because you can be there as a historian and be sympathetic towards the Soviet soldiers that fell, because we must remind ourselves the Red Army was made up from people from across the Soviet Union. Many of these countries are now independent from Russia. They're not involved in what's going on in Ukraine. I'm going to try and avoid, as best I can, talking too much about the world we live in today. But of course, you can't ignore the fact we live in the world today where Russia has occupied Ukraine. So with this cemetery would contain Ukrainian soldiers dead, Russian soldiers, and soldiers from other parts of the Soviet Union. So it's complicated. My reaction as I walked around there was one of a mixed feeling. You can be there as an observer and try and maintain some kind of neutral stance and accept the fact that everyone who dies in conflict is in some ways a victim, and yet some people are clearly fighting for a non-ideal regime, and those that fought and died for the Red Army, it may have felt at the time like it was a better regime than the Third Reich, and clearly some of the areas that were liberated by the Red Army had monstrous things going on under the Third Reich, and then it led to, as I said a few minutes ago, to a equally monstrous period that lasted, in fact, even longer. So there's people like Brad watching this, hi Brad, and other historians, and I'm interested into what they would think if they were there. These are names of Soviet soldiers who died in 1945. Now, if you were to spend time in this cemetery, you would see the origins of these names are from across the Soviet Union. There were Jewish Red Army soldiers who fought in the Battle of Budapest, for example. So should one consider them differently to those that were from Moscow? Volunteers, are they different to those who were conscripts? I don't know. These are interesting questions, but I thought, if nothing else, you'd appreciate seeing these photos and appreciate the fact that I was presented with a kind of a moral and historian conundrum in that I was looking at these statues and monuments. And the cemeteries are one thing, because obviously they are in some cases individually honoring those who've, and these two photos are interesting because this is the 1956. This is the next Soviet invasion of Hungary. This is 1956. So these men are also honored by a monument to another war, another invasion. And I didn't know what to feel when I was looking at it, when I was taking photos, and I don't quite know what to feel when I'm looking at them today. The fact that the 1956 burials are kind of intermixed with the 1945 burials, and then you have all these other Hungarian burials in the cemetery around these graves there, and they're just there. They're not being they're maintained. People must visit them. They're part of the Budapest environment, and that's it. And these individual ones here, where you have photos of Red Army soldiers, and one of my Russian friends who lives in Normandy from Siberia translated a couple of these for me, and you can't help but be sympathetic to soldiers who fell fighting the Third Reich, because the Third Reich was a monstrous, evil organization. The Nazis stood for everything that good human beings should stand against, and the Red Army, the Soviet Union, were an ally of the West during this period, during 44 and 45, and then something different happened. Then after various shady dealings and goings on and difficult situations through 46, 47, 48, the Warsaw Pact gets formed, the Soviet Union, it becomes what it was, and we would now have a different feeling about these graves. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, Brad. My wife's grandfather is Jewish Pole who fought in Polish units within the Red Army. So as he says, how's that for complicated? Yes, it's complicated. And I think what I'm getting at is that history, it doesn't matter if it is complicated. It doesn't matter if, as an observer of something like this, you can have mixed reactions to it. It's okay to have different things going on in your head at the same time. I'm lucky in some ways that by living in Normandy, it is put on a plate for me. The goodies and baddies are much more easy to identify there. And we're not denying that sometimes there were atrocities carried out by individual Allied soldiers, but the norm was that the Allies were the good guys in the West and the Third Reich were the bad guys out in the Eastern Front. And this is kind of Central Europe. There was just murder and mayhem and massacres and atrocities on all sides, and not just occasionally. It was common there. So that was the Budapest cemetery where the fight took place. This is another park more in central, the city part of Budapest. It's a very, very impressive Red Army monument there, and you can't help but admire the craftsmanship of this panel there that shows the Red Army soldier. And the classic image I've now realized on these monuments is the great coat, the helmet, and the PPSH 41 submachine gun. Sometimes the heavy, machine gun on the wheels. That seems to be a very iconic image they use a lot in these monuments. And again, I was impressed by the construction of this monument. I was impressed by the design of the monument, and of course I was grateful, I suppose, that the Red Army liberated this part of Hungary, and Hungary had been the Axis. It gets all very complicated, and I'm not going to go into the politics of it all and the various changes in Hungarian leadership that occurred in the latter part of 1944 and into 45. But the point is that these statues, these monuments are what they are. That seems to be the kind of image you seem to get repeated all the time, that classic image of a Red Army guy with a PPSH 41. I took these photos and I was pleased to be there, and it was complicated being there at the time, not least of which because we were always tired. We did a hell of a lot of walking on this trip and a lot of drinking in the evening, so I wasn't always, and my friends and colleagues were not always immediately reflecting on the significance of these monuments. It's taken me a few days to come back and see it. And now there's names of the missing, names of those who fell in Budapest here, and now these photos now of Vienna. Now, what was interesting in Vienna, and we did a very kind of hectic day there. We went to the military museum there, which is fantastic. We saw the car from the assassination in Sarajevo of Franz Ferdinand, all that kind of thing. And yet this monument, which is beautiful, and the sun was out, we're in Vienna, lovely fountains there. The Austrian people, if you look at the back behind the columns there, they've painted over the names of the Russians fallen with the blue and yellow of Ukraine. That was a sort of it's graffiti, it's vandalism, but it was sort of done on a, I'm not going to say semi-official, but it wasn't like two kids going out with a couple of spray cans. This was a concerted point being made by the people of Vienna against this, and I found that very, very intriguing as well. So the monument still exists. The monument still honors, if that's maybe not the right choice of word, the Red Army who liberated Vienna in 1945, and brought the Nazi regime to an end. And of course, Austria wasn't part of the communist bloc. It was in the West, and so they have perhaps an easier way of labeling the Soviet Union after the end of 1945, and they've made this very obvious statement about their dislike, anger about what Russia are doing in Ukraine right now, and yet it's there. The monument is there, but it's been painted blue and yellow, and again, just complicated. It's people are still taking photos of it, people are still walking around it, but there's obviously this significant modern protest going on via the red and the blue and yellow paint there on the monument. Another photo there. So yeah, this is right in the middle of all the touristy stuff in Vienna, all the palaces, and we had a great time. We walked incredible distance that day, and so that's a Soviet Red Army monument in Vienna. Now this is Bratislava. So Bratislava is in Slovakia, and as you walk around the city, and it's not too touristy, Bratislava. There's all sorts of statues, all sorts of areas of history. There's composers and communists and poets and artists and all sorts of things in Bratislava. I took an extraordinary number of photos on a walking tour of the city with Ross Cable, but among it are these statues. And Ross Cable, who is watching now, who took us to Bratislava, so he lives there. He's saying the Hungarians removed and centralized all communist monuments in Budapest to a park. It's telling that the Red Army monument remains in place. So they've kind of grouped them together. So it's almost bringing up what's happening in the USA with monuments to Confederate leaders, to Confederate generals. Is that what is the considered future? Do you remove them? Do you destroy them? Do you group them together? Do you put them in museums? Do you leave them where they are but put a different label on them? You know, do you change the names of streets? And we know this kind of process is happening in the USA right now. It's happened in Britain with slavery. And I guess what I'm saying about is that history evolves. How we think about things is constantly changing. It's in flux. Andres reminding me that there was 45. Vienna was split. Yeah, initially, yeah. So Vienna had a complicated. Every country, every city had a slightly complicated next few years after 1945, as the map of Europe kind of shook itself into a place again. And Canada too. Canada too is having this thing, and then you go into the other aspect of the language used to describe indigenous personnel and things like that. History is in flux. It's good that society reanalyzes the past, reanalyzes the terms that are used. And yeah, this one here is to that one there, what is saying is the partisan movement. So the partisan movement is not quite the same as the Red Army, because this is within Slovakia. These are people standing up against the Third Reich, but then some of these become, what is their motivation? Would they label themselves as communists? It's very complicated. And this one here is to the Danube flotilla. So this is another aspect of the fact that the Danube River itself was used by Navy submarines, were even going up and down the Danube, which is an aspect I'd kind of not realized before that. So yeah, it's complicated. Now this is another one in Bratislava, and you know, you can see for yourself. There's the iconic submachine gun again, and women are represented on this one. And you know, I didn't read all the wording. I didn't look at every single detail of these things there. I'm just sharing some of my photos with you because I think you'd find them interesting. This is on the hill above Bratislava. It's a massive, great Red Army monument with thousands of names of those killed and missing from the campaign. And again, you know, you can only be impressed by the architecture, the view, how striking it is. And I've got some video of this. I'll play this. It's not great footage. I didn't have my stabilizer with, but I'll play this and I'll go back to photos in a second. There's Colin there in his shabby chic coat there. And again, you know, this towers over the city. there weren't many people there when we were there. But there were 2 or 3 other people walking around. I think part of it is they were walking around it because it had such great views of the city. It was a nice sunny day. But yeah, it is. I'm not necessarily judging anybody for any city or nation for doing what they do with these monuments, and I'm not gonna, so it's just interesting. My reactions were complicated. They're still complicated. I appreciated seeing what I saw there, and yet it also caused me to kind of internalize and wonder at what point, we can definitely say the Red Army liberated that area in 1945, and then what happened afterwards turned out not to be a liberation, but it's still a liberation monument. No matter how long that, even if the liberation only lasts for a week and then it went horrible again, it's still a liberation monument. It's just, yeah, it is complicated. But what impressive statues, what impressive architecture. The flag there again, the seemingly always there PPSH 41 submachine gun, and mass graves there, as Ross reminding us there. So, again, as I said earlier, people fall in wars. The Soviet Union was comprised of people from all sorts of ethnicities, all sorts of countries, all sorts of reasons for being there in the Soviet army, from volunteering to conscription. And yeah, it's again, I'm not sure how I felt then, and I'm not sure how I feel now. This is another one just showing a list of names, just hundreds and hundreds of names on this monument overlooking the city. And if we were to spend longer there, we would see names from all across the Soviet Union, east and west of the Soviet Union, north and south, over thousands of miles. And yeah, you can see me and my shirt reflected in the monument there. So, and then there's the view of the city behind. These just very short clips there, and I'll put the photos back up again. And you can look at these statues, and obviously they meant something when they're created, and now looking at them now, they may mean something slightly different now, and people are looking at this with the context of knowing what happened over the next ensuing, whatever it's been, 78 years since 1945, and with what's going on in Ukraine right now, people might be looking at this differently today, and differently again in 5 years' time, and differently 5 years in the past, and that's okay. It's okay to be conflicted about these things. That is what history is all about. History is very rarely black and white. History is very rarely. We've talked about it so often as channel. Generals are not always easily just heroes and villains. They have good days and they have bad days. A unit is not universally brilliant. They have bad days. A unit is not elite all the time. A unit can have a bad day. Leaders can make bad days. A tank is neither brilliant or awesome or bad or terrible. It depends on how it's being used. What's the doctrine behind it? What's the service like? What's the morale of the crew like? Etc. 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 So again, this is at the bottom of the of that big memorial there. Another wall there. It's again impressive, and there's seems to be universal PPSH 41, the great coats. That seems to be the image the Soviets went with to kind of symbolize the Red Army. So, and there's discussions going on a sidebar about leaving statues in place or not leaving in place, and I knew that would happen. And I have different things there. Now this is in Prague. And this is a cemetery, so this is just one plot over from the Commonwealth War Graves plot there, where there's over a couple of hundred British, Commonwealth, Australian, New Zealand, Polish graves there, mostly aviators, but prisoners of war. And then there are graves of Soviet soldiers who fell in the fighting for Prague. And again, crossed PPSH 41 submachine guns on the graves there. And, architecturally, in design terms, these are striking and powerful. And yeah, it's just interesting, and some more Soviet graves there. So I'm gonna leave it at that. If you're expecting some definitive word of wisdom from me about this, well, it wasn't going to happen. I'm as conflicted, I'm as confused, if that's maybe not an odd word to use, about my reaction to seeing these cemeteries and memorials today, a week later than I was when I was there. but it's caused me to think. It's caused me to realize that I should continue my journey to investigate World War II, to bring World War II to other people to understand, and that it's okay to be conflicted by things. It's okay to look at something and have multiple feelings whilst looking at it. And that's what seeing these Soviet stroke Red Army memorials did. It caused me to question what my feelings were. It caused me to look into myself and to look into how history is looking at these events and be introspective and open a dialogue. And we talked about it as a group, and complicated. It's you know, I'm definitely against just blanket removal of memorials. I think that doesn't serve the right purpose. I'm also not in favor of just leaving everything up forever if it offends, if it causes damage, if opinions have changed. I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm somewhere in the idea that discourse should take place, people should consult, they should debate, solutions should be found to you know, relabel, to rehome, to group together and learn. The fundamental thing is to learn why was someone celebrated then and now not celebrated. Why has public opinion gone from looking at someone from one way to another way, and also the fact it could swing, sometimes it can swing back the other way. I mean, that's how history goes. What's that famous expression? One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Opinions change as time moves on. So there we are. I think ultimately learning from the past is not always easy, and we should just embrace the fact that we have a past we can discuss, and embrace the fact that we can have this dialogue. The dialogue, some of you are disagreeing with each other, and that's fine, but we're doing it in a polite way. We're doing it without endangering ourselves. Most of us who are watching this channel are living in an area of the world, I'm hoping, where they can express themselves, where there is freedom of speech, where they're not going to be punished for having an alternative point of view to someone else, although that's debatable sometimes. But we can have these conversations rationally, politely, listening to each other, and understand that opinions differ, and that perspectives differ across the world. And there we are. So that's it. I found it really interesting that ultimately I'm going to thank Ross and Jeff, the Cable brothers, for showing me these places. I don't know that I would have had the insight I had to them without their input. Both Ross and Jeff live in Slovakia, and they travel a lot to Slovakia and the Czech Republic and into Vienna, into Hungary, and their perspective helped me with my perspective, even though it hasn't given me, as I said, keep on saying, a clear, precise view of these things. I'm conflicted. I could be impressed and appalled at the same time. I can honor people, but also accept the fact that they were not perfect. There we go. That's my thoughts. Don't forget, today's proper show about the mosquito is a little bit earlier than normal. It's 6:45 in the UK, or 7:45 if you're in Europe like me, with Roland White, where we talk about the mosquito bomber, and particularly the raids by 140 wing into Denmark and Copenhagen. So there we are. I will leave it at that with you. And as always, thanks for your attention. Thanks for being nice to everybody. And I will see you all later. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV, sharing some of my not completely thought out thoughts, but nevertheless my thoughts about seeing Soviet Red Army monuments. Thanks, everybody. Bye.